to the May Mid-Coast Watersheds Council community meeting. I'm Evan Hayduck, Council Coordinator for Mid-Coast Watersheds Council. Trevor, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Okay, just letting one more person in there. Hi, everybody. Trevor Griffiths, Watershed Restoration Specialist with the Mid-Coast Watershed Council. Thank you all for coming.
Yeah, should be a good one tonight. I do have my screen shared right now just to quickly go over the agenda for the evening. Here we are at number 1, meeting called, greeting and introductions, and I always miss, this is the normal time we go around the room if we're all in the room together and introduce ourselves, but we'll just stick with this virtual format for a little bit while longer, hopefully, and be back to in-person meetings here soon enough. So again, welcome. We just have a couple quick announcements I wanted to go over before we get to our presentation. There's our presentation there, the Bring Back the Pollinators with Matthew Shephard. And then a reminder to everyone that after the presentation, we do have a couple quick updates from some local groups that are related to pollinators and kind of a way to how to get kind of attached locally to do some work with pollinators if you're interested. So stay tuned for that. And then after that all wraps up, we will have a short break, a little 4 or 5 minute break, and our normal board meeting business to follow after that. So everyone's welcome to attend that. That's open to the public, but feel free to head out after the presentation if that's your main interest here. So just a couple announcements, just to spread the word. Really, we have a couple job announcements that are out or coming out. One right now is there's 2 riparian restoration technician positions open with our partners at the Lincoln Soil Water Conservation District. This is our kind of shared restoration crew that we work with quite a bit. They do all our planting and maintenance on our planting projects, and we're excited to hire 2 new members of the staff over at the district to help us out moving into the future. So if you know some strong folks who like planting plants and grubbing out blackberry and doing all that kind of fun stuff, get a hold of Trevor or myself, or send them to our website or the website of the Lincoln Soil Water Conservation District to find that announcement. And then Mid-Coast, our group will also be hiring soon we don't have a final title, but it's going to be something close to outreach and administrative assistant. And this is going to be a 3rd staff member for the council, which is exciting because Trevor and I are both full of work, and there's still more work to do out there. So we'll be getting out an announcement here hopefully in the next week or so, and we're trying to get interviews scheduled for June and get someone started by early summer around July 1. So if you know anyone else who's interested in that type of position, we're also it's going to be an outreach, education, and kind of admin type roles. We'll get that out here in the next week or so and spread it far and wide, and hoping to get some good candidates to interview for that job. So that's it on the job front. We wanted to just put out a quick word, a couple updates. It is springtime, and one thing that comes with spring is the birds. I'm a birder myself. I go out and look at birds any chance I kind of have to get out there. Couple things, obviously the spring migration's going on. It's a really good time on the coast. We're lucky out here because just about anything can show up in your backyard. We get rare birds all the time. I had an acorn woodpecker show up in my backyard, which is really rare for Lincoln County. They're obviously over in Benton County, over in the Oaks, but that was some excitement this week. Couple notes on this bird front. There are some issues with mostly finches and salmonella and some disease issues going on at feeders. So there was a call a while back to kind of stop feeding birds, but I've seen some recent stuff from some folks that I trust that say you can continue feeding birds, just do really good upkeep on your feeders, make sure they're not getting that black gunk that's kind of mold and gross stuff that can kind of hold that bacteria and kind of pass that along. So keep feeding those birds. They like it on their way through. Just make sure you're keeping those feeders clean and refreshing them and cleaning out water if you have a water source for them and all that kind of stuff. One more thing on birds, I'll go all night, but I'll stop here soon. Don't worry. Kind of a local success story in the works that's going on that I think it'd be interesting for maybe a future presentation. Our snowy plovers on the coast are really rebounding in the last few years. There's been a lot of them, new nests found along the coast in Lincoln County and up north and south as well. And I know one of our former partners used to work for U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, who's now retired, Roy Lowe, himself has found 11 new nests between Newport and Waldport in the last 3 weeks. And that doesn't sound like a big number, but prior to 2017, there was a 42-year gap of snowy plovers nesting in Lincoln County. So that's a species that has had a lot of interest and a lot of effort to kind of restore, and it's kind of a good success story of them coming back now, which is great. And if you're ever at South Beach or some of those popular spots and you see some fencing, be sure to read the signs and make sure you know what's going on out there. Those fences are exclosure fencing to keep people away from the nests and keep dogs and all those kind of things away to not disturb them. And Paul Engelmeyer mentioned that the babies are essentially little cotton balls. So they're tiny little things. They blend in with the sand really well. So make sure if you're going out to the beach with your dog that your dog's on a leash, and that you are aware of any potential nests out there and you're observing and staying away from those fenced areas whenever you can. So, okay, I'll stop talking about birds and I'll kick it over to Trevor to introduce our speaker for the evening.
Some birds act as pollinators, so it's not totally out of place.
There you go. Thank you for making that connection. Thank you.
So just one quick note before I introduce our speaker is that we hope to have a little question and answer session following the presentation and community updates. So feel free to put your questions in the chat box. You'll see a little feature down there, and Evan and I will take those questions afterwards and facilitate the Q&A using those questions that you put out there. So that will happen afterwards. And without further ado, I want to welcome Matthew Shephard from the Xerces Society. We're really lucky and pleased to have him here. So thank you, Matthew, for showing up to give this presentation for us. Matthew is the Director of Communications and Outreach for the Xerces Societies, and has spent more than 30 years working with people from all walks of life to create better places for wildlife. Matthew's career began in England and took him to Kenya before his arrival in the United States 2 decades ago. He's worked for the Xerces Society since 1999, initially at the vanguard of a national effort to protect pollinators, but now focused on communications, community engagement, and urban conservation. Matthew is the author of numerous articles and other publications, and co-author of books including Attracting Native Pollinators and Gardening for Butterflies. He learned gardening at his mother's side and has created and maintained wildlife gardens everywhere he's lived. Beautiful. So round of applause for Matthew. Thank you for joining us, and the stage is yours.
Well, thank you so much. I'm very pleased to be here. I wish I was all in one room with you all together. That's always a more pleasant experience, but at least this way we can all get together, and it's at least it's one way of connecting. So, but yeah, thank you so much for having me here this evening. There was a nice bio which I admit I wrote, so it was complimentary. But I mean, I've been involved with wildlife conservation for decades. I left college in the 1980s and got involved with community conservation projects, and have had the good fortune to be able to remain involved with that ever since. Now I'm focused on insects. I became obsessed with insects years ago, and when I moved to Oregon, by chance discovered the Xerces Society and was able to get a job there. So I'm going to share my screen and make a start on the presentation. Hopefully now you can see that. I'm also hoping, and I apologize, I'm hoping that my internet connection will be stable enough. Sometimes it's a bit up and down, so if it looks like it's going to get wonky, I might just turn my video off, because after all, you don't necessarily need to see me. I think it's more important you can see the screen. Bring Back the Pollinators. I'm going to be talking about what things you can do to help and support native bees. I don't know entirely the kind of places where you live, so I'm sure there's some gardeners, there's some small landowners, there's some forestry owners, possibly farmers. I'm not quite sure who you are, but the way I approach pollinator conservation is I try and present information about the bees, understanding what they need, and the kind of the natural history, because I want you to, when next time you go out, wherever you're going, to start looking, and you can begin to look and assess any area from the perspective of understanding, what you can begin to look at it as if you were a bee, and you begin to see whether they have flowers or nesting or whatever. And I will get into some things that you can do, but I'm not going to give you a specific plant list, for example, because even gardeners, any gardeners will know that every garden is different soil, different exposure, different moisture, different sunlight, different wind, etc., 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 and everything is slightly different. And there are some fantastic resources out there now that will help you nail down specific plants that you might want to put in, etc. But I want to talk through the process of pollinator conservation so that you have an idea of what to look for and what to do. So the Xerces Society, we are a non-profit organization. We're actually 50 this year. We were founded in 1971. Our name comes from the Xerces blue butterfly, which used to fly in the San Francisco area and is one of the first butterflies known to go extinct in North America because of human activity. And so that's our inspiration at the most basic level. We're trying to prevent further extinctions. We work through hands-on conservation. So we work with landowners, land managers, gardeners, park managers, whoever. We help them to create habitat. We have staff who can go out and work directly to help prepare management plans and planting programs and all that kind of stuff. We do advocacy, i.e. there are times when we'll stand up and say, that's not a good idea, you shouldn't do that. We would be working to change how people use pesticides, for example, or gain protection for rare and declining species. We also conduct research. We are a science-based organization, and what that means is that everything that we do, we try and make sure there's evidence for. We don't just sit in the room and say, wow, we should do this and then hope it works. When we go out and give advice, when we are involved with advocacy, we base all of our actions and use the evidence, use the science to help inform and shape what we do. And then we also do education, and that can be as broad as going out to tabling at an event, doing a workshops on a farm, and like this evening, sitting here talking to you, and hopefully, getting you inspired, getting you enthusiastic, and making you want to go out and change the world. The Xerces Society, when I started there, was only 5 of us, and now we're about 55 strong in staff. But we don't work in isolation, because Xerces as an organization is far bigger than just those staff. We have our volunteer ambassadors who go out and do events and such like for us. We have the Bee City USA and Bee Campus USA affiliates, which is now part of Xerces, and that's why I'm so excited that the Newport folks are here, because I'd love to hear more about what they're doing. We are a membership organization, so we have our individual donors, some 12,000 or more, scattered across the world. We have the private foundations that support us. We have scientists who we do research with or who advise us, and they're the ones who keep us scientifically honest so that we're not going around spreading bad information. We also partner nowadays with a fairly significant number of companies, some of whom are providing funding to support our work, and some of whom we're just working directly with them. Agricultural companies, food companies, we're working with their supplier farms to introduce habitat into the farms and all this kind of stuff. We do the same with state agencies, local, federal, anybody we can work with to change on the ground, because as an organization, we don't own land. So the real change needs to happen on the ground, and that's where individuals, whether they're a farmer, a landowner, a gardener, all of those people are the ones who are actually making the change on the ground. I probably don't need to explain why we should care about pollinators, but I do like to always have a few slides just to cover the basics, so we know what we're all on the same basic level. So about 85% of flowering plants requires a pollinator to move the pollen, either within the flower, between flowers on the same plant, or between flowers on different plants. And that pollen is moved around, and thanks to that, the flowers will get fertilized, and then the seeds will be produced. And so the next generation of flowers will be there for whoever or whatever needs them. A very selfish level, for people, maybe as much as 1 in 3 mouthfuls of food and drink that we consume is thanks to a pollinator. And that is, berries, apples, all sorts of other orchard fruits, various nuts, and it goes on and on and on. And it's the kind of tasty, nutritious stuff that we get from them. And if you like numbers, possibly in excess of $30 billion value of crops in North America each year is produced thanks to the work of a pollinator. But beyond people, beyond the kind of selfish view, if you broaden out, pollinators are at the heart of a healthy environment because they're at the center of so many remarkably complex food webs. Just from the simple perspective of the seeds and the fruits that are a result of the pollination feeds great numbers of songbirds and game birds, mammals up to and including grizzly bears. And as well, we must recognize, and Evan, this takes you back to the relevance of what you're saying about birds. Pollinators, whether we're talking about butterflies, moths, bees, they get eaten themselves. And so they are a really important component of supporting wildlife of all sorts. In fact, about 96% of songbirds rear their offspring on insects, and a lot of that is caterpillars. But beyond that, just kind of emotionally, culturally, the work of pollinators kind of defines our seasons, enriches our lives. Springtime flowers that you see, they're pollinated. The summer berry picking we do, the jack-o'-lanterns and Halloween scares and fruits of Thanksgiving pie. All these things that we have thanks to pollinators. And so without pollinators, our lives would be less rich, less diverse, and our environment would be degraded. Thinking about who the pollinators actually are, there are some birds that pollinate. Now, hummingbirds are the ones around here that are the main pollinators. Elsewhere in the United States, there are a couple of species of bats that pollinate, and at least one species of dove. But the huge majority of pollinators are insects, and there are 4 major groups of insects that give us the bulk of our pollinators. From the top left here, you have butterflies and then moths in the center there. This is one group of insects known as a Lepidoptera. They feed at flowers, and as a result of that, they pollinate. There are also a large number of flies that are pollinators, flower flies, all sorts of other flies that will, again, they're visiting the flowers to feed, and as they do that, they pollinate. And the same on the lower left there with beetles. Not a huge number of beetles, and they often actually go into the flower and they're eating the flower. But in doing that, they rummage around and they get covered in pollen. In fact, you can see the yellow pollen on the face of that cleric beetle. And then the other 2 photos on the lower level, you've got wasps and bees, which like butterflies and wasps and bees go together to make one group of insects known as Hymenoptera. And these are, particularly the bees, are the most important single group of insects that we have as pollinators. And the reason for that, there are 3 distinct behaviors which bees display. One of them is that they're actually actively collecting and transporting pollen. So they go to a flower, they gather pollen, they stick it on their body, and they move on. And that means that the pollen is being moved very effectively. They also have a nest, and they're collecting the nectar and the pollen to take back to the nest as food for the offspring. And so by doing that, that means that they're going out from the nest and flying, foraging on the flowers and going back to the nest, and they will go out again, and they go out again on numerous foraging trips. And so they're working the area around their nest very intensely. And the third thing that they do is a thing that people call flower constancy. Bees are intelligent insects. Once they've figured out how to manipulate a flower, how to get the nectar, how to get the pollen quickly, they will go from one bloom of that species to another, and then to another, and then to another, because they can work most efficiently and most effectively, get the greatest amount of food for the least amount of energy. And by doing that, they're moving the pollen very precisely from one flower to another of the same species, because if you take pollen from a sunflower and it goes to an aster, it's not going to help either plant. But if you go from sunflower to sunflower to sunflower, or aster to aster to aster, then it's fantastic. But with all of this, we have to remember that the bees don't get up each morning. They're not like getting up and going, oh, I must go off and pollinate. They go to forage and feed their offspring and feed themselves. And the pollination is a byproduct of co-evolution. Some people might say it's chance, but it's certainly not. They don't go out, the bees don't go to do that. But it is this amazingly efficient and amazingly important relationship we have in our environment. So when we stop and think about bees, we probably, a lot of people imagine honeybees. They think of honeycomb, they think of stripes, they think of hairy bees. And so we often have this kind of image of bees being fat and hairy and black and yellow, and we have pictures of honeycomb and honey and colonies. And although there's an element of accuracy in that, or an element of truth in that, it really does not represent the reality of our bees. First of all, honeybees are not typical bees. And also, this is probably not a typical person either. Most of us wouldn't want to have our face covered in a few hundred or a couple of thousand bees. Honeybees are the only bees that live in such large colonies. They're the bees that have such a really distinct and rigid caste system of, you know, the queen and the workers and the drones and the guard bees and the nurse bees, etc., etc. They're the only ones that make honeycomb. They're the only ones that make honey in any such volume, because as a colony, they try to survive winter or wherever they are in the world, whichever period of the year there isn't enough forage. So they make enough food to sustain the colony. Also, honeybees are not native to this country. They were brought to the country, as best we can tell. They arrived in around 1620, seems to be the earliest reference to hives being brought on a ship from Europe. They are incredibly important for crop pollination. And there's no doubt at all that honeybees are suffering. You only have to read the media to know that the numbers are falling each year. They're affected by diseases and pests. They're poisoned by insecticides. They're impacted by low nutrition. And honey prices fluctuate, which impacts the commercial beekeeping industry. But it's the commercial beekeeping industry that's largely responsible for us still having honeybees, because they're able to rebuild the colonies. And although for years now we've been hearing about, honeybees are endangered, honeybees are in crisis, we still have, the best part of 3 million hives of honeybees in the United States, and they can support the commercial agriculture, although it's touch and go some years. And there are some crops that have much higher demands for them. But although honeybees are the ones that dominate our media and often fill our minds with images of bees, they are in essence livestock, and they're maintained by our commercial beekeepers. The Xerces Society as an organization works on native biodiversity, and we focus on the native bee species. And there is an incredible diversity of native bees. Just to give you an idea, in the United States, there's a little over 3,600 species of bees. In Oregon, as far as we know, there's between 600 and 800. I have a figure here for the Portland, Vancouver area of 125 species. I don't have stats or numbers for the mid-coast region, but it's definitely going to be in that realm, and it may even be more, depending on the size. And then in a single garden, you can have 30 or 40 species of bees, and there's evidence from work actually happening in Portland of some gardens having twice that many species, which is quite startling to most people when they start thinking about the diversity. I'm just going to introduce you to some of this diversity to give you an idea of what bees look like. Bumblebees, we probably will all recognize a bumblebee. This largely fits our images of a bee: black and yellow, round, hairy, fat. You see that pale lump on its hind leg, that's the nectar and pollen that it's collected. And so these in some ways are similar to honeybees. Certainly in terms of how they carry the nectar and pollen, but we probably recognize those as a bee. It kind of fits our image. But some bumblebees don't, they're moving on even within bumblebees. We have bees that, we think of bees as being yellow and black, but here's one that's got a lot of orange because they come in all sorts of different colors. We move away from bumblebees and even into a bee that a lot of people are aware now. This is a mason bee, also known as a blue orchard bee. And many people have these in their gardens and they rear them in some cases. But to many people, they look at these and they go, isn't that a housefly? Because it's blue. It's moved on from that image of yellow and black and hairy. And some bees are startling colors. This is metallic green sweat bee. It's common. You find this almost everywhere you go in the summer, and yet it's this bright green metallic like a flying emerald, and some of them, like this photo, it's flecked with gold and just an amazing insect. And then some are, that last one at least had stripes, so it kind of fitted a bit of our image. But then you can move on and you find bees that don't have stripes at all and will just be a bright color. Other bees are drab, they don't have the colors, but still might fit what you think a bee should look like. This one is the longhorn bee, named after the extraordinarily long antennae that its males have. The female longhorn bee doesn't have such long antennae, doesn't have the bright colors that you might associate with bees, but it is striped and hairy. And if you look on its hind leg, you'll see it's carrying the pollen there, but it's not a wet lump like you have in a bumblebee or a honeybee. It's just the dry pollen. Most of our native bees, they have a patch of long stiff hairs somewhere on their body, usually on their legs, sometimes on the underside of their abdomen, but they just carry the pollen dry. And this is one reason why they're such effective pollinators, because the pollen falls off when they get to the next plant, or at least not much of it, but just enough to pollinate. Leafcutter bee. This is now, we've gone away from it. Most colors, we're into these dark drab colors, but you'll see the underside of its body is yellow. This is where it carries its pollen. It has stiff hairs on the underside of its body, and that packs the pollen in. We also have mining bees that don't look at all distinctive, just brown and drab, and you may not recognize this as a bee. And then just to compound it all, most bees are tiny, and so you just see these little insects that don't look like a bee, and you're not quite sure what they are, but they are out there. And when you slow down and stop and look, you may just start recognizing the diversity that you have. In many ways, the best thing you can do is to just take your morning coffee into your garden or into a field, wherever you can go, and sit down and just spend time observing and watching and seeing what comes past. So that's a kind of a very rapid review of the diversity, and all of those types of bees you'll find on the coast. And I want to look now at some of the things that bees might need, you know, the natural history, where they nest, how they use flowers, etc. The life cycle of a bee is just like the life cycle of a butterfly. You have the adult lays an egg, the egg hatches into a little squirmy grub, a little squirmy grub transforms into the pupa, what, you know, in the butterfly world you call a chrysalis, and that takes the adult form, and then eventually it will emerge as the flying adult again. Now, for most of our native bees, this takes an entire year to complete this cycle. The adult will be alive and active for 3 or 4 weeks. During that period of time, the bees will mate, and then the females will get on with making the nest. And almost all of our bees are solitary, so one female is making her own nest. This particular example is a mining bee, and she makes her nest in the ground. So she actually excavates her nest, she digs in. She makes a narrow tunnel, and off the tunnel she'll make a series of brood cells. In each of those brood cells, she will take the nectar and pollen that she's been collecting. She makes a ball, as you can see in the lower right, and on that she lays an egg. And then that egg will, within a week, that egg will hatch, and you get the little grub. The grub is inside this cell. After laying the egg, the mother, the female bee, will seal off that cell, and she never meets her offspring. The grub will feed inside the cell, go through several molts. After 3 or 4 weeks maybe of growing, maybe a little less, and then it pupates and it begins to take on that adult form. And at that point, its development pauses. We've taken, you know, a month, 5, 6 weeks maybe to get to the pupal stage, and then it will remain like that for the rest of the year, and it will emerge the same season that its mother was active. Now, where might you find these nests? That last example was a ground nesting bee, and roughly 70% of our native bees are ground nesting. So that means that within the United States, there's about 2,500 species of bees that are ground nesting. And in our local area, you know, 70, 100 species, something like that, that we might encounter in the ground. And they don't need vast areas of bare ground, they just need access to soil. The photograph in the center there is a lawn. It's actually in a home orchard, and there are these mining bees in the lawn at a density of 20 or 30 nests per square foot. And you can have thousands of these bees nesting in a good area. And you may not see much, except when you have that many, when they're emerging, you'll have this constant movement and hum of bees. But otherwise, you might just see a little hole in the ground or a little mound of dirt, and not much at all. But then underground, depending on the species, the nest may be just 4 or 6 inches deep with a few brood cells off it. But there are some that will go down 1 foot or 18 inches or 2 feet. Sometimes more, and then you'll have these amazing networks of branching tunnels and the brood cells, etc., underground. So it is an incredible work of engineering, and there are so many different bees, and we can't say with accuracy exactly what type of soil the bees prefer, but on the whole, bees tend to prefer sandier soil. But that said, you will find bees that nest in hard clay soil. You find bees that actually will nest actually in sandstone, and will bring water to soften the sandstone and take an awful lot of time to make a tunnel into the rock. Most of the rest of our bees, again, they are solitary nesting, and they are occupying existing tunnels in a dead snag, a hollow twig, All sorts of different little places where they can sneak in and make their nests. And what these bees do, these will take that tunnel and they will divide it up into a series of brood cells. And this is how our, the well-known, the mason bees that people are aware of now, this is how they make their nest. In fact, that drawing on the right, that lower one, that is a mason bee nest, a cross section. You'll see that the mason bee has built a series of walls out of wet soil, which is why they're called mason bees, to divide that tunnel. Let's put the food in there, laid the egg, and then made another wall, and another brood cell, another wall, another brood cell. The upper illustration is a leaf cutter bee, and in this case, they take these neatly trimmed pieces of leaf that they will take and they will kind of stitch together and glue together using saliva and their jaws to make a completely enclosed brood cell where they put the food and the egg. And if you're lucky enough to see one of those, it kind of looks like a tiny little short cigar. And the other thing that obviously with these bees they need are the nest materials. So you need the nest site, and now they need the nest materials. And this is a photograph of a leaf cutter bee. As you can see, it's bringing in that beautifully trimmed piece of leaf. And so some bees will collect leaf pieces, some mulch up and chew leaf and bring in a ball of chewed up leaf. Some collect wet soil, some collect resin or small pebbles, all sorts of materials that they need. So that's another aspect of what we need to provide for the bees to successfully nest. Then moving on beyond our solitary bees, we do have bumblebees, and there are about 50 species altogether in the United States. And in Western Oregon, we have a remarkable diversity of bumblebees, and we may have 15 species altogether in the Willamette Valley and the Coast Range and the coast itself. And these are social bees. They do have a small colony. It's not a perennial colony like a honeybee, so that they're not making large amounts of honey, just enough of slightly watery honey compared to honeybees, but enough to feed themselves for a few days. They need a tumble down area, maybe an old mouse hole that they can take over. And they do build these waxen pots, as you can see in the right-hand photograph there. And a big colony may have 300 or 400 bumblebees by the end of the summer. I say it's an annual colony, so at the end of the summer, most of the bees die, leaving just a few mated queens who go into hibernation, and then they emerge. And in our part of the world, they'll start emerging in mid to late February, so they have a pretty long season. And the other thing that bees need, I mean, obviously, it's like they need flowers. But they need a diversity of flowers to support that diversity of bees, because although most bees will take nectar from wherever they can, some bees are very particular about the type of flower they'll take the pollen from. And pollen is a really important food for their offspring, because it has carbohydrate, protein and amino acids and all sorts of great stuff that their larvae need. Just briefly about the threats, I mean, threats face all wildlife, and bees, butterflies, pollinator insects are no different from a bear or, eagles or birds, whatever. There are threats to them. And the most obvious of these is habitat loss. And sometimes the habitat loss is really visceral. It involves bulldozing, it involves scraped dirt, and it involves construction. And you're like, whoa, it feels like it hits you, and you're like, yeah, that can't be good. But for insects and for pollinators, sometimes the habitat loss is really piecemeal and small scale, and we may not even recognize it as habitat loss. These two photos, two landscapes, they offer almost nothing for a pollinator. The lawn, there's no flowers in it, there's no bare soil, even the shrubbery and the trees in the background don't offer much in this particular image. On the left there, the bark chips, yeah, you put that down and you lose the chance to have flowering plants, you lose the chance for ground nesting sites. And so that's habitat loss, and it's just as significant for pollinators as bulldozers. And because pollinators, and at least the ones that we're talking about now, are insects, pesticides are a profound threat. These glass jars are full of dead bumblebees. I don't know if you remember, at the time it was a lot of media coverage about it, but in the summer of 2013, there was a big box store in Wilsonville, just on the southern edge of Portland, that treated the tilia trees, the linden trees in its parking lot against aphids. And they used systemic pesticides that got into the trees. And it happens that when those trees flower, they are an incredible magnet for bumblebees and honeybees. And over a period of about 3 weeks in that parking lot, it's estimated that 50,000 bumblebees died. These are samples collected from that site and taken off by the Oregon Department of Agriculture, who tested it and were able to demonstrate that the loss of these bumblebees came from the treatment of those trees. So that, I mean, that's a big example, a large scale, but anytime we're using pesticides, wherever they are, there's a risk to the insects and the pollinators. And then the other thing that we're all kind of struggling with now, and in Oregon after last summer, where we had such severe fires, it's a bit more in our minds, climate change. You know, we are seeing warming, drying seasons. We're seeing less snowpack in the Cascades. There are studies that have been done that demonstrate that, particularly in some areas, I mean, not in Oregon so far, but in the Rockies, where flowers are blooming earlier than they used to, but the bees are not emerging yet. And so there's a disconnect between the plants and their pollinators. And so there's all these big things, some of which are like, whoa, like what on earth can we do to try to address those? But the good news is there are really definite things that we can do. And I know that at times it might seem like, well, what does what I can do have an impact? And I would say yes, because if everybody does something, then all those little somethings put together will make a lot. And it's far better to do something than nothing, because if we do nothing, we've got no hope of creating the change that we need. And one of the fantastic things about pollinators is that they are small, they don't need big areas. And so even if you don't have acres and acres and acres, if you've only got a small plot, or if you do have a lot of acres, you know, you may, depending on what you're using the land for, you may not be able to convert it all into habitat, but there are things you can do around the edges. And together, all those little things will amount to a really significant transformation of our landscapes. And if we focus on habitat with the right plants will support all of those native bees. Habitat across the landscape will allow wildlife to move. If we're seeing changing climate and significantly changing environment, one thing we need to hope for is that we can allow the wildlife to move as the climate and the conditions change. So all of these things, all of those big problems can be addressed with habitat. Before I dive into habitat more deeply, backyard beekeeping has become a popular pastime, and I've spoken to numerous people, and I keep seeing this in articles, and people are saying, "Wow, backyard beekeeping, we're going to save the bees." Well, the reality is that backyard beekeeping isn't going to save the bees. There are reasons for honeybees. You know, you might like honey, you might just want an intimate relationship with a fascinating insect. But having bees in a box, particularly non-native bees in a box in your backyard, is not going to help native bees. In fact, it's possible that it might increase competition with the native bees, the wild living bees. And so that's one reason why we at Xerces Society are so focused on habitat, because habitat will help our native species. It will also help the honeybees, because they also benefit from having good habitat, flower-rich habitat, and habitat that is pesticide-free. And so moving on to habitat, when we're thinking about habitat, we need to try and create habitat that supports the entire life cycle of the bees. So they need secure nest sites, because remember, they will spend a year in that nest. So if the nest is not there a year later, that's not helpful. They need flowers for foraging, and they prefer a pesticide-free environment. And again, harking back to not needing a large patch, this photograph on the left, that has the flowers that the bees need, it has the nest sites in the ground that the bees need, and it's pesticide free. So you don't need a big area. If I remember correctly, that's actually a little south. That's at Yahoo. And I spend time there. I'm nerdy enough so that everywhere I go, I sit around and stare at bare ground and find stuff. And there were bees coming in and out of nests in that bare ground on the side of that bank and foraging on those flowers. So, you know, everything those bees needed were in that one small patch. And so natural areas, we must hang on to the major natural areas we have. The wildlands that support diverse meadows, even the smaller areas that might be along the creek corridor over the back of somebody's back fence. We need these because they provide the refugia, the refuge. They provide the consistency that our pollinators need. But then there are so many other areas where, you know, within disturbed areas, within areas that we live, which together can support bees. Just quickly, in farmland, you have field margins and track sides that have flowers, for example. The backs of roads and railways and sides of ditches, you'll find plants and bare ground for nesting. School playing fields, you'll find all sorts of little bits and pieces that support the pollinators. City parks can do good. Parking lots, bioswales, power line easements. Power lines and trees don't mix, so there's acres and acres of open grassland there. You need creek corridors again there, an area where dead trees can be left to stand, and of course gardens and these much smaller areas. And one reason these work together is this concept of partial habitats. I know it seems dumb, but bees can fly. It's like, duh, of course they can fly. But what this means is that they don't necessarily need the nest sites and the flowers in the same place, because they can get over a road, they can get, you know, over the farmer's field, they can get through the sports grounds, and they can get to the areas where they can find the nest sites they need and the foraging areas that they need. In terms of distance, basically the bigger the bee, the further it can fly. And so some of our really small bees, and some of them are tiny, like a 1/12 of an inch long, they may only fly 200 or 300 feet at most. And that's like a city block. And that's not so far, but the bigger bees can fly a quarter mile, a half mile, sometimes a mile or more. And so we need to be trying to provide the habitat. It doesn't need to be big areas, but we need to be providing it in as many places as we can. With the bee nest sites, the first thing is to retain what we have. Dead trees, we often lose them because they're considered to be eyesores or a hazard. But where we can keep them, do that, because they're fantastic, not just for bees, but for all sorts of different wildlife, as well as, cuckoos and birds, and they're like an apartment condo tower for wildlife. Bare ground, unassuming, doesn't seem like it's an important habitat, but the lower photograph there, that's in a golf course in the Portland area, and people were looking at this going, wow, it's a scruffy patch that needs to be tidied up. We went and looked, and we actually found 8 species of bees nesting in that site. And so again, doesn't have to be big, doesn't have to be dedicated wildlife area, just needs the right conditions. And although that last photograph showed a slightly larger area for nesting, this is in my garden, my front yard. And that area between the concrete driveway at the bottom and that lump of basalt is only about 10 inches. And you see just tucked underneath the edge of that basalt, you can see 3 holes with a little pile of dirt around each one. And that's where the bees are nesting. They just need access to bare ground. So don't mulch everything. Try and make sure that you have little patches of dirt that the bees can get to. In places where we can't keep snags, and certainly in smaller gardens, we don't have space for large dead trees. There are some plants that we can be growing to provide the nesting sites, like elder and raspberries. Have soft stems or stems that will be hollow in time, and those are natural places. But but we can also recreate these kind of things with nesting blocks, with bundles of hollow stems from things like bamboo or common reed, because the bees are not too choosy. As long as they've got that tunnel, as long as they've got that hole, these mason bees, the leafcutter bees, the yellow-faced bees, all sorts of other bees will go in there and they'll create the brood cells. If you're making blocks, anything between 3/16 inch diameter and 3/8 inch diameter holes are good, and try and make them 4 to 6 inches deep, because the deeper they are, the better they will be for the nesting. Because one thing I didn't mention earlier is that bees, the female bee can control the offspring, control the gender of her offspring. She can choose to fertilize an egg and it'll become female, or not fertilize the egg and it will be male. And when she's making a nest in one of these tunnels, she always ends her nest with 3 or 4 male bees. And then it's only the female bees behind that. And so if your tunnel's not very long, you don't get many female bees, because you'll always have the same group of male bees at the end. So the deeper your tunnel, the more female bees, and they're the ones that do all the work. And these kind of tunnel nests really do work. They're a really successful thing to do. The top one is a commercial block, and you can see all the holes are filled up and they're sealed off with chewed up leaf matter. And the bottom one is another mason bee bundle of bamboo stems, nothing fancy, and each of those is sealed up with mud. And so these things really do work. They also work in supporting more than bees. I mentioned earlier that wasps and bees are the same group of insects, and they are very similar. They have very similar habitat needs. A lot of them nest in the ground, a lot of them nest in tunnels. And these, again, are solitary wasps. These are not yellow jackets, they're not hornets. They're very gentle, and they're great to have around for the pest control. And so what you're doing to support bees will also support your local native solitary wasps. When it comes to bumblebee nests, I already mentioned that they're social, and they might ideally prefer like an abandoned mouse nest or so on. But you can make a box. Again, you're kind of replicating that same idea of a cavity. They're not so particular. Anything will be fine. You can just like use old tea kettles and they work, or a 6-pack styrofoam cooler can work. You know, they're not too choosy. This is an example of a wooden box. It's about 8 inches on each side and about 6 inches deep. There's a 3/4 inch plastic pipe that acts as the entrance tunnel. And in it, we put a little bit of, this is actually upholsterer's cotton, with something short fibered and soft. Just the bumblebees like to have something soft to add to start their nest. It's a really nice project, and some people love making them, but really they're of limited value, because maybe only 1 in 5 of these ever get occupied. And so you're much better off just trying to make sure that there's the right habitat, the tumble down untidy areas where you might get mice nesting, or matted grass, something that the bees can get in and will find the shelter and space that they need. Moving on to forage patches, again, they need flowers. So wherever we can keep the existing flowers, that's great. Wherever we can add new patches, that's great. And locally native plants are better. And where can you plant? And I already said that I wasn't going to try and give you prescriptions for every area, but when you look around your landscapes, wherever you are, you'll find you can create hedgerows, and hedgerows could be across the middle of fields, or it could be the edge of a forest. You can create a wonderful shrub layer on the edge of a forest that will support all sorts of wildlife as well as the pollinators. You can create meadows, you can create insectary strips up the middle of fields, you can plant up the sides of fields, up fence rows. In parks, you'll find areas where you can allow the grass to grow, and you can plant up, introduce native plants. Roadsides, whether it's a rural roadside or an urban suburban roadside, that they can be fantastic, because these are often areas where trees and shrubs don't want to grow, or they cross otherwise desolate areas. And so they provide a great opportunity. And then once you get more and more urban, community gardens, business landscaping, and of course our gardens, all of these can support an amazing diversity of bees and other wildlife. When we're choosing plants, we like to think about the color. Bees have really great color vision, but their vision is shifted. And so they can, although they can see most of the colors we do, they really don't see red. It's like they're red-green colorblind. And so if you imagine trying to find a red flower against green foliage, it's not easy. So red flowers are not so great. Pink works nicely, white, purple, yellow, even orange, but red is not so good. Diversity, we like to try and have a diversity of flower types, and that's the shape of the flower from a really open plant like the one here, which is a blanket flower, or sunflowers or asters late in the year, and compared to these really enclosed flowers like you might have on lupins, for example, that are much harder for some bees to get into. So we try to have 3 or 4 different species blooming during each season, and the bloom period, as I say, bumblebees might be emerging in late February, so they will need flowers to feed on, and they might be active all the way through to late September into October, and sometimes even later in mild fall. And drought tolerance, obviously, as we're thinking about climate change and all of that, we try to put in plants that will survive dry conditions and don't require a lot of tending and care, and don't require irrigation. One, it provides resilience as our landscapes and our environment are shifting, but also it just uses less resources. If our snowpack in the Cascades begins to go down, or in the Coast Range, and we're losing some of our water supply for drinking, the first thing that'll get banned is going to be hose pipes. So looking ahead, let's try and make sure our landscapes can cope with those conditions. I said native is best, so I'm not going to give you a prescription, but I just want to give you an idea of some of the great plants that are out there, from on the left, early season through to late season on the right. And we have manzanita, a great coastal plant that is fantastic for bumblebees and others. We have the small shrubbier, the flowering willows. They are an amazing source of late winter forage, and maybe one of the key plants for bumblebees. So we move into the spring, we start hitting the realm of lupins and also beach peas. So there are lots of, dunes and coastal conditions are amazing for bees and all sorts of other insects. Later in the summer, beach daisy is one that you'll find. Late summer, the asters of all sorts that are really important in late summer, but those are like goldenrod and some of those other well-known late summer, early fall plants. On the lower right, that's a plant called Biden's. Beggar's tick is another name, and that's a wetland plant. We don't want to forget that just because an area is soggy, it can't support pollinator plants, and that's a late season plant again that supports bumblebees late in the year and all sorts of other insects. And the one that I didn't skip, I was coming back to in the middle of the bottom there, native thistles. I know thistles have a reputation as a nasty, nasty weed, and it's true, there are some, but they're not the native ones. Canada thistle, bull thistle, yellow star thistle, some of these other problems, but the native thistles are not problematic. They're not so invasive, and they are an incredible nectar source that are fundamentally important to supporting pollinators, butterflies, flies, beetles, bees, all sorts of insects will go to those. And so if you have space for some of our native thistles, I encourage you to have them. And if we're just looking at gardens, or maybe a flowering border, a park planting, a business campus, yeah, native plants are, I would always encourage people to have native plants because they are so good. They will support greater diversity and abundance of native bees than others. But within these more formal landscapes, there are some great plants that we can choose that are not strictly native to our region. Two examples here I have are the purple cone flower that is native eastern part of the United States, and it's what some people refer to as near native. And there are some great varieties and great plants that will support and feed a lot of different insects. And then there are plants like at the bottom there, you have that's sea holly, and that's a European plant, and so that's distinctly not native. But again, it's a plant that will survive the conditions. It's statuesque, it's beautiful, and it's an amazing source of nectar for insects in a garden. With all of this, it's worth remembering that some of the modern varieties and cultivars have, not by design, but inadvertently, they've lost their ability to produce nectar and or pollen. And so there are some plants now that you find in the garden centre that are not great. So I recommend you choose heirloom varieties, these older cultivars and varieties that have not been so manipulated, because they support more. And if you're looking around at a garden centre and wondering which plants, look to see which ones the bees are visiting, because that's a really great indication that those are the ones that bees will like. I'm going to touch briefly on pesticides. I don't usually say much about pesticides because on the whole, just don't. You know, most situations, particularly in gardens and more managed landscapes, you don't need pesticides. And it's partly because in creating this diverse flowering habitat and supporting the pollinators, you're also creating conditions for all sorts of other insects. And so you do bring in the beneficial wasps that are controlling any potential pest insects. You're bringing in the syrphid flies whose larvae eat aphids. You bring in the lady beetles that are such great predators of soft-bodied insects. And so just try to avoid pesticides wherever you can. And if you must use them, minimize their use and read the guidance on the label very carefully, because they do have what's often referred to as the B label. But even if you follow that to the T and do everything that's said, you're still introducing a risk to the pollinators. And that example I had earlier of that the Wilsonville, the bumblebee kill on the trees in that parking lot, that was actually done according to the instructions on the label, and yet it was still devastating to the local bumblebees. And another thing about pesticides and insecticides in particular is that they're now systemic, and a lot of people are aware of the neonicotinoids as a particular group of high risk insecticides, normally just referred to as neonics. Because they are systemic, they are inside the plant, which is great as a effective tool for protecting that plant against biting, chewing insects, such as caterpillars. But it also means that all parts of that plant are now carrying that insecticide, and that includes the nectar and pollen. And that does directly impact the pollinators, obviously. Sometimes it kills them. Other times it just affects behaviors, makes it harder for them to forage, makes them less good at navigating, makes them slower. And it is this low-grade impact that's incredibly broad, widespread, but is infecting everything. And unfortunately, it's a problem that lasts over time, because once the plant has been treated, that insecticide can remain effective for weeks or sometimes months in some woody shrubs. And it's also displaced over distance, because the plant will be grown one place and where it's treated goes to the garden centre. You buy it, you take it home, and it can be miles and miles from where it was grown, and yet that plant still has a slight risk. Oh, there we go. This is the alternative to pesticides. Now that you've created this amazing pollinator-friendly area, you're going to bring in all these other insects, the wasps, the lady beetles, all sorts of other predators that will be there controlling the pests you don't want. And I'm just going to wrap up now with a few slides, just to kind of take you to things you might be able to do beyond your immediate, your garden, your community garden, your roadside, your park, whatever. There are ways in which you can make your seemingly little patch into something of a bigger movement. We have the Bring Back the Pollinators pledge, which you'll find there's a URL, bringbackthepollinators.org, or you just go to our website, which is xerces.org, and you'll find it. And it's a simple pledge that we just ask people to take it and make a commitment. Grow the pollinator-friendly flowers, provide the nest sites for bees and the egg-laying sites for butterflies, avoid using pesticides, and share the word. I mean, 3 of those are what I've been talking about this evening, and share the word. Well, in my case, I'm here tonight. But if you're doing this, it could be as simple as putting up a sign or talking to your neighbor. You don't have to like go around waving placards or doing public speaking or anything like that. You can also make your community bee friendly through something like Bee City USA, and I'll let our friends from Newport talk more about that. But there's now 250 affiliates in the city and the campus program across the United States. And so it is this amazing program. And when we find out what the affiliates do collectively, there were like 800,000 people across the country were engaged volunteering through these affiliates, which is just astonishing. And thousands of acres of habitat were created, which is an amazing, amazing thing. You can also get involved in community science programs as an individual. Now that you've got your beautiful habitat, you can start watching and observing what's there. And particularly there's Bumblebee Watch, which you can do as an individual anywhere. And the Pacific Northwest Bumblebee Atlas, which is a more involved, where you have to adopt a grid square, and anyway, it's a bit more involved. But Bumblebee Watch, all you do is you take photographs, upload them to a website through the app or through your computer, and then you help build this incredible nationwide knowledge of what bumblebees are where, and what their habitats are. And then others, things like the Great Sunflower Project, which you don't do anything more than spend 15 minutes sitting in the sunshine, counting the number of pollinators that come to a patch of flowers, and then reporting that. And all of this helps us understand and informs. And again, this is all part of our science base that informs what we do. I know I've thrown a lot of information at you, and I don't expect you to have absorbed or remembered all of it, but there's lots of information out there. These are the books from the Xerces Society that you'll find wherever you buy books. We also, if you go to our website, xerces.org, you can download fact sheets, plant lists, conservation guidelines. There's a wealth of information there that you might find, hopefully will find helpful, and will help you understand how to create habitat and manage habitat for pollinators wherever you are. You can also, you'll find us on YouTube. We do webinars, we have videos. You can, if you don't want to read, you can spend time viewing. You can follow us on social media, where we post updates and share information. Finally, I have to say we are a donor supported, and my boss would not be happy if I didn't highlight this at some point this evening. If you feel like Xerces is a wonderful organization and you'd like to support us, we'd be extraordinarily grateful. This is how our work is funded. The end. Thank you so much for your patience and time this evening. I'd be very happy to answer questions now or whenever. And thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Matthew. That was great. Wow, you were right about that being a lot of good information. So that reminded me that we will, we're recording this, and we will post the video of this on our website for people to watch again and again to try to absorb all that. We'll also put links to your website and possibly some of these other initiatives that you mentioned alongside that on our website. And we did generate a lot of good questions coming in, but I think we ought to keep the ball rolling here and try to get some of the other community updates that we mentioned at the beginning going here as well. Does that sound good? So Maxine, do you want to go first? I think you're unmuted now.
Yes, thank you.
Great.
I'm with a group called Concerned Citizens for Clean Air, and way back in 2007, we were granted a 25-mile no-spray area by ODOT along Highway 101 between Newport and the south to the Lane County line. So we also volunteered to help remove invasive weeds. And as we observed the weeds being removed and the herbicide being removed, we noticed native plants coming back and wildflowers and weeds. And we noticed pollinators coming back and other wildlife. It just seemed there was more life along the road shoulders. And they were green, of course, instead of having those ugly brown stripes. At any rate, we have always been interested in native plants and encouraged native plants. And we got the idea that, well, we've already accomplished something for the pollinators. There's 25 miles of roadway with no herbicides and lots of weeds and wildflowers and native plants. So we had the idea to go to ODOT and ask to make it a pollinator corridor. Well, they took some time and they ended up giving us 19 specific sites that we could plant along the 25 miles with pollinator gardens, or they're not really gardens, they're going to be strictly native plants. We've planted one already. We're in the process of doing 2 more this fall. And in addition to that, our group has educational events. Before the pandemic, we used to table at the farmers markets and have monthly meetings and other activities. And we welcome any community members who would like to join us in supporting the pollinators in this way. We have work parties and we have educational events and fundraising, and there's lots to do for people with multiple talents. And we could certainly use people with interest in building a website for us about pollinators. That's about all I have. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Great. Thank you, Maxine. Yeah, that's perfect. Matthew generating all this passion and love for these pollinators, and then here's the perfect local outlet here. I'm gonna go help Maxine here. And so we have also Michael Cavenaugh and Anita Albrecht from the City of Newport. Thank you so much for joining us. And so is Newport officially a Bee City USA?
Yeah, so appreciate you guys inviting us to talk about our local program, and Matthew, thank you for the great presentation. So there's 2 of us. There's myself, I'm the Parks and Rec director, and then we have Anita. She is our city landscape specialist, and I'll let her kind of dive into the weeds on the details of what she's been doing. But so our program as a whole, we've been in Bee City USA for 2 years now, so we're a very young program. It got started with my predecessor working closely with Anita, and Anita has been involved from the beginning with the Bee City USA certification. Matthew obviously explained what Bee City USA is, gave a brief overview, and then COVID-19's kind of put the brakes or pumped the brakes on our department a little bit in regards to actually moving forward and doing really great things through Bee City USA, just because we had to reduce staff and whatnot. So with it being so young, we're still developing the program as a whole for Bee City USA within the City of Newport. And so we're checking the boxes to be certified, but we want to grow and expand more. So we're looking at more community outreach, whether through guest speakers like Matthew, and then maybe even community programs that we can offer, whether it's free seed packet handouts, education pamphlets to go with that. We just did that. We're Tree City USA, and we just did a drive-through event where we had about 80 or 90 residents come through a drive-through and pick up trees and seedlings, and we want to do stuff similar to that for Bee City USA. We want to continue to expand the city's support by educating and providing these resources to the community. So we want to be able to just provide our residents or non-residents with the tools, the resources to do these things on their own property. Obviously, these resources, these avenues or channels of resources would be our city website. I'm going to share real quickly our web. I guess I can't share screen. Not a problem. Our website, if you go to newportoregon.gov, the Parks and Rec page up at the top, there's a little link that's Bee City USA, and on there is a lot of different resources, documents that we found. We just actually recently uploaded the Pacific Northwest Bumblebee Atlas to that page. And so we have that. We've got a long list of what we're trying to do, and then a lot of key link and resource information there for the public to view. We want to work with our library. We work closely as Parks and Rec and Library anyways to provide more resources to them for our community members to find. And that's through books, online informational resource pamphlets. I think they're also going to be doing a gardening tool checkout program over there. That's something to, it's kind of that diversity, equity, and inclusion thing. Not every household can afford these type of things. We want to expand our community garden. Within our parks as a whole, our community garden program, we have an amazing garden that's over at Frank Wade Park, but we want to have more locations besides just that one spot with community gardens that'll have pollinator plants in there. So that'll help facilitate it. We also want to go through, Anita and I were just talking the other day about it, identifying spots just in our parks, spots that we're not utilizing to the max potential. So that way we're being good stewards for pollinators within just, random places within our parks and other city parcels of land that we can do these type of developments. On our recreation side, in our rec center, we want to be able to offer education programs, guest speakers, and then maybe outreach events like I kind of explained how we did for Tree City USA. And then also with the city admin, on my level and above, something that I recently pitched to our city council and we'll be working on is an integrated pest management plan. We have been a herbicide-free city, but we really haven't addressed any of the other pesticides out there, for insects, moles, moss and different areas. And so those things are all tied together, and it's going to be an overall policy, not just for Parks and Rec, it's going to be for our public works, our airport, any of our departments and divisions that are operating outside doing this type of application. So we were just going to update that policy and continue to re-educate ourselves, every so many years to update that policy. So it's always a policy in work. And again, if you guys want to access our webpage, it's newportoregon.gov. And then just search for the Parks and Rec department and you'll find a Bee City USA link, and that'll take you right there. And then that's all I got. And I'll pass it to Anita, who's in the next room, and I'll let her kind of dive further into what she's doing.
Hi there. Hi there. Matthew, that was great. I think education is the place where we begin to sort of open ourselves up to understanding the value of everything in the world, all the life forms. And as a gardener, I just have become more and more committed to making sure that whenever I plant, I am considering the pollinators, planting in swaths, choosing single petal flowers and flowers that are going to work for the pollinators. I've done a couple of pollinator specific gardens for Newport. One is at our coastal park, the Don and Ann Davis Park. Just this year, I looked across the street from us. We have a parking lot that's used for our farmers market, and the median strips in the middle of the parking lot were just sitting there fallow. So I got a volunteer crew. We cleaned up the median strips and I planted California poppies and they're coming up. So we should have a nice flowery show of California poppies right across from City Hall in a parking lot. I planted around the rec center. I am every opportunity I can putting in things that are going to benefit our pollinators, and hopefully in some way, shape or form, I can help educate people in the city of Newport. Possibly we could even get a demonstration garden going. So those are the level of my efforts and enthusiasm for this. Thank you. And oh, I'm open for any volunteers that might want to come and volunteer for the City of Newport, and you could contact me through the city. My email is a.albrecht@newportoregon.gov, and I'll put you to work. Thank you.
Lots of opportunities to participate. We'll take some volunteers too. We have volunteer days, so you know. I mean, we do have a native plant nursery that we help operate with Oregon Department of Parks and Rec Department, and that's all focused on native plant species too. So we're trying to play our part and get a lot of native species planted out on the landscape as well. And so it's great to hear that other people are doing the same, and all of that type of work sounds like it'll benefit pollinators. So yeah, thank you all for coming. And if you could stick around for a little bit longer, maybe we'll work through some of these questions that came up. There's some interesting ones in there. Evan, do you want to start us off with some that you saw?
Sure. So the first one I saw, I did see that Paul Hader did put a bunch of, or not a bunch, just a few links to some interesting articles in there. So if folks are looking at the chat box, there are some good links there for some more information from Paul. Thank you for that. Fran did ask, when you were talking about the tunnels and the bee nests in the ground, do they reuse the same tunnels every year?
No, they don't.
Okay. So they're making
not
new tunnels every year.
Yeah. There are, I mean, there are some bees that will occupy old tunnels, but they're different species and they're just looking for a smaller diameter tunnel. But no, I mean, once a nest has been occupied, then on the whole, it won't get reoccupied. And so, like, just expanding out a little bit from that, if you're getting into like mason bees in the backyard, there's a fairly well established process where you need paper straws in your blocks, and you can pull the paper straws out, and then you can clean the block, and you take the cocoons and you clean those, and you get rid of any that are diseased, and you keep the good ones in your fridge or wherever. And then but the reality is that most people don't get into that. I've met a lot of gardeners who are like, yeah, it was really great, I'm going to do that. And then they don't, because it turns out to be fiddling. And so, yeah, the blocks lose, or the stems or whatever, they lose their benefit over a period of 2 or 3 years. And so the thing to do is either just take them and chuck them out, because at that point they're just full of dead stuff. Or you can, with blocks, you can re-drill them with the same diameter hole, and then clean it with a mild bleach solution and put that block out again. But really, just have a fresh block, put a new block out each year, and so there'll be just a cycle of fresh nesting.
Well, that answers a question I think that I got emailed to me in advance of this, which was around mason bee care. So thank you for anticipating that. I have a question from Armand here that he says, I live on the coast, and most of our wide open sandy areas 60 years ago are evilly vegetated. Is there, I'm pretty sure
Heavily?
Heavily? Oh,
that's my guess.
Yeah, heavily vegetated. Evilly, I was thinking of the European beach grass invasion, which is, has really anchored down a lot of dune grass and
Sure.
pretty evil plant. I don't know. But is there known concern about open dune species adapted to the special plants there? Any studies? I help manage Oregon dune areas on Forest Service lands, so I'm keen to improve knowledge and action on our lands.
This is a kind of, here's the episode of Stump the Chump. I don't I don't know of any specific research that's been done myself. Probably the best thing is to connect you with some of our other staff who work more on wildlands and some of these more natural areas and would have better access to resources than me. Dunes are really important and do support an amazingly rich diversity of native bees and wasps because the sand is so good for nesting. These are not typically the tunnel, the wood nesting bees. Those are not going to be mason bees and others, but there's this a huge number of ground nesting bees, mining bees, and longhorn bees, and all sorts of stuff. That the sand is just fantastic material for digging the nests, and so dune systems can be really important. And as you know, a bigger dune system will have sandy areas and low areas with wetlands and so on. So just a great diversity of flora in there as well. But I don't have specific information available, but if you care to contact me, I can connect you with our conservation staff.
So one question from Bill was, are there pollinator bees that are also carnivorous bees?
No. That was an easy one, wasn't it?
That was good. That was quick.
Bees themselves are vegetarian, so they just are feeding on the nectar and pollen. Wasps are, at least almost all of our wasps are predators, and so they're collecting other insects or whatever to take back to the nest to feed their offspring, but visiting flowers for nectar to fuel themselves while they're hunting. But there is one small group of wasps that are nectar and pollen collectors, and so they're effectively like a bee that's a wasp. But we do have a few of those in Oregon, but not many.
So here's another one that might be a little nuanced, but in a typical small town on the coast of Oregon, have you studied and produced a list of the kinds of spaces that can be developed to promote and support pollinators? If yes, where can we find that information?
This is another answer, which is going to be no, simply because we haven't created a list. But I could walk around whether it's a small town on the coast or anywhere, and it's going to be the same basic places. You're going to find roadsides, you're going to find parks, you're going to find field edges, you're going to find medians, you're going to find domestic gardens, you're going to find businesses. A lot of the places that Anita and Micheal were mentioning in Newport that they're working on, those are the kind of places that you're going to find available and able to develop habitat. And I know it's about habitat, but it doesn't have to be habitat. It could just be a garden with the right kind of flowers in it, or bare ground that you can protect. And sometimes pollinator conservation actually involves doing less than you might otherwise, because you're not trying to tidy something up. You're not trying to vegetate a bare patch. You're trying to retain some of that untidiness and some of the chaos. And so sometimes pollinator conservation is actually easier because you're kind of doing nothing.
Okay, another one from Armand here. So regarding the pesticide-free slide, often effective restoration of degraded habitats by controlling invasive species, yes, budget is part of this, requires use of herbicides. Judiciously used, biggest tool we use is a backpack. Other than timing treatments using low toxicity herbicides, what other concerns or thoughts do you have about this?
I mean, I'd also add to this that we use herbicides for site preparation. We do a lot of habitat creation work. It's not our land, so we're working with the farmer or the landowner, and so herbicides get used on some times for site preparation because it's really important to spend time preparing the site before you plant. There are other ways of doing it using solarization and other approaches, but yes, for invasive species control, for weed control, yeah, targeted backpack spraying is a really good tool. I'm just thinking about the specifics of it was quite a long question. I have to think a little bit about this one. The timing is one to hit the best time to control the plant. And sometimes, although with herbicides, it's not so much a concern about residues for, like with insecticides, it's the residues in the plant that are the problem. With herbicides, there isn't that concern for our pollinators and other insects. So the timing is making sure that it's the best time to control that plant, because you could also mow and cut, but if you choose the wrong time to cut a thistle, it's just going to be back the next day. And it's the same with the herbicides to get it at the optimum time. I realize I'm fumbling around a bit here. Yeah, I mean, really comes down to careful use. There may be some products that are more effective for controlling the weeds. Glyphosate is one herbicide which has a lot of concerns around it and been in the news. I mean, Roundup from Monsanto, but that's not the only brand, but that's the best known one. And people are concerned about human health and also, amphibian health, etc., etc. So, I mean, yeah, there are times when you're going to be having to consider the product from broader than just pollinators.
Yeah, that's always one we grapple with as restoration practitioners as well, trying to be.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say
tool.
Our attitude is there are times when you'll use it because it's better to have a short-term hit for a year, or to have a year of herbicide use and then decades of herbicide-free habitat. But going in and using it to control the problem species before you plant is better overall.
Okay, here's a nice little specific one for you. If a spider web covers the front of the tunnel on a mason bee block, are they not viable?
It's unlikely that the bee would push past the web, but it's not unknown. But the chances are, if there's a web, that means the spider's occupied it already. So the bee would probably get a surprise.
So one from Susan, do pollinators have water needs? If so, what are they?
Most do not have water needs. They get the bulk of the moisture they need from the nectar. The ones that do have some kind of water needs include mason bees because they need wet soil. So, there's an indirect water need. But really, when we talk about water and pollinators, it's primarily related to honeybees, because honeybees will collect water to take back to the hive to use for the air conditioning and help cool the hive. But the majority of our pollinators, they don't need water.
Great. Well, I always like to throw these in. Here's one from Margot that says, "Wonderful presentation. Thank you so much."
Thank you very much. No, that was the easy one.
Well, so Sunetta asks, do you work with Rogue Grouse Society or Pheasant and Quail Forever pollinator projects? Have you heard of those? Do you work with them?
I don't know if we have any partnerships or collaboration with them here in Oregon, but we do partner with Pheasants Forever and Quail Forever in other parts of the country, mostly in the Midwest at the moment. I don't think we have a connection with the grouse group. But yeah, no, it's true. There's one reason why pollinators are such a great topic to work on, because the benefits are so much broader than just the pollinators. And so there are opportunities to tweak some of the other programs. We work with Natural Resources Conservation Service and resource conservation districts and others all over the place who are doing plantings, and like someone wants to plant a hedgerow or put in vegetation for soil erosion or whatever, and say, okay, well, that's great, let's just tweak the plants that you're putting in. All of a sudden you've got you've got an additional benefit. You're not only providing the windbreak that you wanted, for example, but now you're supporting the pollinators, or you're not only providing the game bird habitat, but now you're also supporting the pollinators out there. So it's a really a great opportunity that can be integrated into all sorts of different situations.
All right, I think we just have two more here, and then we'll let Matthew get on with this evening. Paul asks or comments first, I hope you and your team will be willing to help with the silver spot recovery strategy. Can you speak to the recovery efforts for that species?
I don't know the silver spot strategy specifically. That's our endangered species team who've been working more closely with that. Sorry, I prefer to be honest and say I don't know. Then I could fill time, but it wouldn't help anybody, would it? So
that's perfectly fine. Thank you.
How about can you briefly discuss cuckoo bees?
Oh, briefly, darn it. Cuckoo bees are like a whole group of bees that I kind of skipped because they're quite. Cuckoo bees, how we have this image of bees as like busy bees, hardworking. Well, the cuckoo bees are the sly ones that don't bother with all the hard work. And it's actually a surprisingly high proportion of our species are cuckoo bees, and they're called cuckoo bees because if you know the cuckoo bird, it lays its eggs in another bird's nest, and then it has, it's the host that raises the egg and rears the young, and that's what happens here. The cuckoo bees, they kind of hang around the edges of these nesting sites, waiting for the female bee that's making the nest to fly away, and it sneaks in, it lays its egg in the unfinished brood cell, and flies away, and the host bee doesn't notice it. She finishes off her nest, and then the cuckoo bee egg will hatch. And one of the first things it does is that it gets rid of the host egg, or if there's a grub in there, it kills that, and then it eats the food supply that the host female left there. So yeah, I mean, there are these, and so, in fact, some of our rarest bees are actually cuckoo bees, and there are bumblebees that are cuckoo bumblebees, and the queens will go into an established nest and fight the host queen and kill her off, and then take over the entire nest and have all these other bees doing all the work for her. But they rely upon there being an adequate population of the host species, and when we're losing bees from some areas, it's cuckoo bees that are among the first to actually disappear. So yeah, they're out there. They're part of our native systems. In fact, I mentioned the Pacific Northwest Bumblebee Atlas, and there's a cuckoo bumblebee, I think, that is one of the prime target species that Atlas is hoping to track down and map in the next couple of years.
Very interesting. Did not know about cuckoo bees, but thank you for sharing that. Let's see. I am tempted to ask some of the questions that I wrote down myself, but I think it's getting pretty late, so maybe we'll just leave it at that. Very fascinating. Thank you so much for joining us and delivering that great presentation. Thanks as well to Micheal, Maxine, Anita for joining in and
Yeah.
giving the community updates. And like I said, we'll put links on our website and a recording of this, so you can circle back to our website at midcoastwatersheds.org and find out how to get engaged with the opportunities that were mentioned in here. So I think with that, say goodnight to anybody that doesn't want to stick around and hang out for a riveting board meeting that we're planning on having after a little break here, but we'd understand if you decided to log off. Anyways, anything else, Evan? I'm sorry.
Nope, we're all good. Thank you. Thank you, Matthew. That was great.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you so much. Have a good evening.